So, just a few days ago, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, made a statement claiming that Canada doesn't have the systemic deep roots of racism that the US does. Yikes, that was almost as bad as when Prime Minister Stephen Harper declared at the G8 summit that Canada has no history of colonialism. You gotta love tone deaf Canadian politicians. But to return back to Doug Ford's comment, he, of course, is receiving a lot of backlash for making this statement. So he's now trying to backtrack and clarify that that's not what he meant. And he's even acknowledged that Canada actually has decades of racist history, which, of course, isn't going back nearly far enough. But I think these comments are worth discussing because to me, they're indicative of a much larger problem that we see play out in Canada time and time again. And that is, we never really have to own up to our own mistakes and issues because we are always comparing ourselves to our good old next door neighbor, the United States. And I'm going to show you some images, and you can tell me if you see a certain pattern playing out. I'm sure you picked up on the pattern very quickly, but in memes like this, America is depicted as this very intense and brutal kind of place, and in comparison, Canada comes across as very whimsical and innocent and charming, and I think it's comforting for a lot of Canadians to believe in that kind of fairy tale narrative, but unfortunately, it is just not true. And while I get that images like this are created as a joke, they're trying to use national stereotypes to get a quick laugh out of people, ultimately, I think an image like this can be pretty harmful because it's trivializing a very serious issue that many Canadians face, but not many Canadians acknowledge. And that is, for many Canadians, interacting with the police is not fun and games, and it's actually a matter of life or death. Because just like in the United States, and just like many other countries around the world, Canada has a long and active history of anti-Black racism, police injustice, and systemic oppression. And what makes this particular brand of Canadian racism especially insidious is that so many people are unwilling to confront it or even acknowledge it, let alone work together to try and fix it. So in today's video, I kind of wanted to explore this attitude a bit more deeply, why so many white Canadians are unwilling to have meaningful conversations about racism in a Canadian context. And because this is a booktube channel, I'm going to frame my discussion by talking about some literature. So I'm going to talk about some of the books that I was required to read in school. Then we'll quickly discuss the always controversial Canadian literary scene, and I wanted to finish this video off on a more positive note by leaving you with some recommendations of some fabulous books that are written by Black Canadian authors. So let's dive into it with some flashbacks from my memories of being in school. Because sadly, I think it's not just internet memes that reinforce this lesson that Canadians can just get off the hook by lazily comparing themselves to Americans, but actually, that's a lesson that I think was reinforced at my time in school. The image that you now see before you reflects how much I felt like I learned about racism in Canada during my time in school, which is pretty much nothing. Now, that's not to say that I didn't have some educators who really cared deeply about social justice issues, and I actually learned a lot about racism in my classes. However, the racism that I tended to learn about seemed to only happen in this horrible, mythical place known as the American South. And luckily, this problem seemed to be completely solved by the end of the 1960s, so that was well before I was ever alive. So it always seemed like racism was something that we could dissect from the comfort of the present, just like you could talk about barbaric tendencies from the medieval period, because humans had evolved and life really wasn't like that for anyone, anywhere where I was living. Then, looking back on all of the English classes that I took, I was only ever required to read 2 books that featured Black characters. One of them was Underground to Canada, which I read in grade 5, and the other one was To Kill a Mockingbird, which I read in grade 9 at the start of high school. And I think it's worth mentioning that though both of these books feature Black characters and discuss issues regarding racism, both of these texts were written by white female authors. And I don't want to open up the whole can of worms about what authors should or shouldn't be allowed to write about. The issue that I'm highlighting here is that we never got to read about the Black experience from someone who has actually lived that experience. So I just don't think that the literature was really as authentic or informed as it really could have been. So let's start by discussing Underground to Canada by Barbara Smucker. Now, let's keep in mind that I last read this when I was 10 years old, and my memory is appalling, so I can't comment on the quality of the writing. But from what I remember, this is about a girl who has an opportunity to escape slavery, and she travels through the Underground Railroad, and she ends up in Canada and gets to start her life all over again. Now, don't get me wrong, these are important subjects for children to learn about, and I do remember that there was something powerful learning about what slavery was like from the perspective of someone who was going through that experience. I do remember that being quite haunting, but my issue with this book comes with the ending, where Canada is kind of presented as the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and that getting to Canada is going to solve all of the main characters' problems, when that's not really the case for many people who did end up in Canada. Once again, if you compare it to the United States, yes, they were free. However, this book and our discussions about this book never acknowledged the fact that Canada did have a history of slavery, and also it didn't acknowledge that life was really harsh for many people who ended up here. I think Lawrence Hill's book, The Book of Negroes, does a good job of confronting this myth, because his book features these African American characters who side with the British during the American War of Independence, and in that way they're able to earn their freedom, and they move to Nova Scotia, and they anticipate that they're going to have a better life in Canada, but they are bitterly disappointed because they are faced with hostility and outright violence from the settlers in Nova Scotia, who are very resentful of them. And I feel like books like these don't confront the racism and segregation that many Black people experienced in Canada for a very long period of time. This is super off topic, but I also just had to mention that while I was Googling for some images to put into this video, I discovered that Barbara Smucker wrote another book called Amish Adventure, and the cover of it really cracked me up. Apparently it's about some people who get in a car crash with a horse and buggy, and they discover the Amish, and it is a wild time. And I don't know, I just thought that book sounded pretty hilarious. Maybe we should have read that one instead. Next up, we've got to talk about To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and this is kind of an intimidating text to talk about because there are so many people who have a very strong sentimental attachment to this book, and also it's a book that is still pretty provocative, and there have been so many conversations in the English teacher world about whether this book should still be a required reading option, and there are lots of hot opinions in that debate. Speaking from my own point of view, I really did not enjoy reading this book as a 14-year-old because I considered myself to be quite a mature 14-year-old, and I wanted to learn about serious issues, but I didn't want to do so from a child's point of view. So I really disconnected with the narrative voice and the kind of simplistic tone that everything had. It always seemed very clear what the moral lesson was supposed to be, and I think I would have liked a text with a bit more complexity or ambiguity. I also didn't gain much from the way that we studied this novel because, once again, racism was presented as something that only happened in the American South over 50 years ago, and it wasn't really a problem that we had to worry about today. And I know that there are educators out there today who can do a much better job of making this novel seem more relevant, but I unfortunately didn't have that kind of experience in the classroom, so I don't think I gained very much from having read this book. So after having reflected back on my own experiences as a student, I came up with this list of 3 takeaways. These are kind of 3 things that I wish had been different about my education, and I'm hoping that I can keep them in mind to inform my own practice as an educator today. So my first big takeaway is that Canadian Black history needs to be covered in the curriculum. I think it needs to be covered in all classes, not just history class, and I think that it needs to happen all throughout the year, not just in February, like you're checking off some kind of box. And you can see from my own experience, we did not talk about any kind of racism that was specific to Canada. So you can see why Canadians grow up and think that it's an imaginary problem here. because a lot of Canadians just haven't been properly informed, and if their education was anything like mine, all racism was confined to the past and to another place. My second takeaway is that students deserve to see their own experiences reflected in the texts they read. This one boils down to just having more options so that students are able to choose their own text instead of being forced to read something. And I also think that we need to be offering texts that are exploring a wide variety of perspectives. My final takeaway is that educators need to be highlighting examples of Black excellence, because if you can see from the books that I was mentioning here, the Black characters in these books were always presented as victims. And I don't think that that is great representation. If you are only seeing yourself in a story presented as someone who is abused, someone who is suffering, and someone who doesn't have agency. And I feel like none of these stories really explore the power of resilience or civil rights or anything meaningful like that. So I think it's important that students are seeing positive and powerful representation. So, as you can see, there are a lot of things that educators need to be thinking about in order to continue to improve the school experience. And it's not just educators that need to have this conversation, and that's where I want to transition to talking about CanLit, or the Canadian literary community. If you're interested in learning more about the drama and the scandals that have been taking place in the Canadian literary scene, I highly recommend that you check out an essay called CanLit is a Raging Dumpster Fire by Alicia Elliott. Now, Alicia Elliott is a Tuscaroran author, and she is writing about why she, as an Indigenous woman, doesn't feel particularly connected to the Canadian literary scene, but she also includes the perspectives of many other authors, including Rinaldo Walcott, who is a very highly regarded Black author and scholar, and the reason why he's mentioned in this essay is because he got so fed up with the Canadian literary scene that he decided to publicly quit CanLit. That's right, he broke up with the Canadian literary scene, and I want to share a quotation with you about what he had to say about the matter. CanLit fails to transform because it refuses to take seriously that Black literary expression and thus Black life is foundational to it. CanLit still appears surprised every single time by the appearance of Black literary expression and Black life. Because Black expression is reduced to surprise, there has been no sustained and ongoing serious consideration of Black work in CanLit. You can write the same essay over and over again and no one will notice. The lack of Black representation in the Canadian canon of literature is actually shocking. For instance, if you take a look at the new Canadian Library series, these are supposed to be affordable paperback versions of books that are considered to be canonical works of Canadian literature. I think there are almost around 200 books in this series, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think only one of these books has been written by a Black author. Can you imagine, out of an entire country's literary history, and only one book by a Black author is considered to be important to that country's literary history? Like, that is truly disturbing. This blatant refusal to acknowledge the contributions of Black writers towards creating the Canadian literary canon is maybe only a small example, but it's one that I think is really indicative of the larger problem that we're seeing across Canadian institutions around the country. So in today's video, even though I've only really touched upon my experience in the educational system and looked at some issues that we're seeing in the literary community, I think it's clear to see that Canadian institutions perpetuate a culture of anti-Black racism in Canada by consistently erasing Black history, failing to acknowledge Black cultural contributions, and avoiding to meaningfully discuss the lived experiences of Black Canadians. I also think that this damaging trend of totally ignoring Black history and Black perspectives has been one that is fully intentional, because a lot of these institutions are committed to helping fabricate and create this myth of Canadian tolerance and multiculturalism, but really only on a superficial level. But one thing that gives me a lot of hope for the future is the way that social media and the internet is changing the game about who has access to information. So I think it's really powerful right now how people are able to directly share their experiences on social media and the way that people can create and share meaningful resources. So maybe if your experience at school was anything like mine and you didn't really learn anything about Black history in Canada, luckily there are so many resources available online for you to go and learn that information. I think that that's a responsibility that Canadians should be taking on. We need to know this history, we need to know the problems and to address them before we can really hope towards changing them. Because that's something that I think it is really worthwhile to work towards dismantling. This Canadian illusion that just because we're not as bad as the United States means that everything's fine and we don't actually have problems of our own to address. So I wanted to wrap up this video today by sharing some quick recommendations for books written by Black authors from Canada. So I'll start with 5 books that I have read before and I found to be highly informative, engaging, or enjoyable. So the first one of these is Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Past to Present by Robin Maynard. I would say this is a great go-to nonfiction book if you are looking to learn anything about the way systemic oppression operates in a Canadian context. It does such a wonderful job of going over so much history that you probably aren't familiar with at all because it doesn't often get taught. And it also provides a lot of clear examples and explanations for how different state-run institutions, like the legal system, the police force, or the educational system, how they're kind of all working together to maintain this unjust system in Canada. So this would be essential reading if you want to get more informed about what's going on. Then for some recommendations for novels, there's Brother by David Chariandy. This is some very hard-hitting but beautifully written literary fiction. This is a rich character study of a boy who is grieving after losing his brother, but I also thought it was a wonderful depiction of the community of Scarborough in Toronto. Next up is Washington Black by S.E. Edugyan. It's about a boy who is raised on a slave plantation but then has the opportunity to leave as he becomes an apprentice to this strange scientific man. This book is a wonderful adventure story that will take you to many parts of the world, but it also asks some heavy-hitting questions, especially about how much was lost because of slavery. It makes you wonder about all of the lives that were cut short, or all of the people who weren't able to innovate or create to their full potential. Think of all of the talent that the world lost because of slavery. So this book is really fun and really heavy at the same time. Next up is Reproduction by Ian Williams. This one recently won the Giller Prize in Canada, and I feel like this one is a lot of fun, and it depicts a Canadian family in all of its wonderful complexity, but not like the stereotypical perfect Canadian family that you'd imagine, but one that is way more true to real life, one that is messy and complicated and really interesting to read about, especially as we see this family at different moments in their history. And then finally, to close off this list, is Theory by Dionne Brand. Now, she has a wonderful back catalog of novels that I'm very excited to explore. This one is her most recent one, and it is about an academic who is unable to finish their PhD, and they are trying to put their paperwork together, and they're also going back through their memories about all of their different failed relationships. So this book struck a really interesting balance of being kind of like a juicy read about someone's romantic relationships, while also being highly intellectual and theoretical. So this one is a really fun, juicy, intellectual kind of read. Next up, I want to share 5 books that I haven't read, but they are very high up on my TBR, and I'm very excited to dive into them sometime soon. The first one of these is an anthology called Black Writers Matter, which was edited by Whitney French, and this sounds like a nonfiction anthology of essays. And what makes me really excited about this collection is that Whitney French really tried to find writers that are coming from all sorts of different walks of life. So I think that this collection is going to contain a lot of diversity and will contain a lot of insight. Next is The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power by Desmond Cole. The title's pretty self-explanatory for this one, but it sounds like this one is chronicling the year 2017 and going through different actions that activists have taken to fight against racism in Canada. Next up is Bread Out of Stone by Dionne Brand. I already mentioned Brand in my fiction recommendations. I've only read one book by her though, and I cannot wait to read more. Next is the short story collection Shut Up, You're Pretty by Taya Mutonji. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know too much about what these short stories are going to be exploring, but I really liked the confrontational title and the floral background, so that was enough to sell me on this one, but I am very excited about it. And then finally is Voodoo Hypothesis by Canisia Lubrin. This is a collection of poetry that partly explores the author's own upbringing in St. Lucia, but I also hear that these poems are really complex and dense in allusions and are very imaginative, so it sounds like a really mind-blowing collection that I'm very excited to dive into. Also, in case you're interested in buying any new books this month, I thought that I'd mention that throughout the month of June, the House of Anansi Press is going to be donating all of their proceeds from the sales of books by Black creators to different funds like the Festival of Literary Diversity, to Black Lives Matter Toronto, and to a different booklist cultural center. So if you want to buy some books and have your money go to some good causes, then you should check out the Anansi Press website. I know that there are definitely a few titles on there that I'm going to be interested in, so I will link that down below in case you're interested in checking that out. This is not sponsored, by the way, just something that I thought was worth passing along. I know it might feel a bit frivolous right now to be buying books when there are so many important causes that are relying on people's support and donations, but I thought I'd leave this out here since it's a great way to show some love to Black creators and to support some Toronto-based organizations. So that's all I've got to cover in my video today. Thanks so much for checking this out, and like always, if you have any ideas or topics that you want to discuss in more detail, please leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Take care, and I'll see you again later. Bye.